Mountain man paid 10 cents for a cabin, then found a fat Amish bride hanging with a note. The auction at Silver Bluff had ended in jeers. No one wanted the rotting shack perched high on Miller's Pass. No one, that is, except Kenneth Boone. For 10 cents, less than the cost of a loaf of bread, he claimed the deed to the forgotten cabin. The townsfolk laughed at him as he walked away, calling him a fool for wasting even a dime on something so worthless. But Kenneth didn't care. He wanted quiet. He wanted somewhere the world could not reach him, somewhere to bury the memories of the wife and child he had lost to smallpox. The climb up the pass was long, the autumn wind biting at his shoulders. By the time he reached the clearing, twilight had bled across the sky, painting the cabin in shades of ash and fire. He pushed open the warped door, expecting dust, cobwebs, perhaps a family of mice. What he found instead froze him where he stood. From a beam in the low ceiling, a young woman hung by a rough rope, her plain Amish dress torn and soiled. Her body swayed gently, her face pale, lips blue. On the bodice of her gown was pinned a crumpled scrap of paper. The words, scrawled in shaky ink, pierced him like a blade. "No one needs me. God forgive me." Kenneth's breath caught, instincts honed by years of war and death slamming into action. He lunged forward, cutting the rope with his hunting knife. The woman fell into his arms, limp but not yet gone. "Breathe," he commanded, pressing his ear to her chest. A faint heartbeat stirred. Hope. With a rough gentleness, he laid her on the floorboards, forcing air back into her lungs. At last she coughed, a weak, broken sound, but alive. Her eyes fluttered open, wide with pain and confusion. "My name is Kenneth Boone," he told her. His voice was steady, resolute. "And I swear you won't die here tonight." The young woman lay wrapped in Kenneth's coat on the cabin's creaking bed frame, her chest rising in shallow breaths. For hours he tended her with the blunt skills of a man used to mending wounds in the field, wet cloths on her brow. Spoonfuls of water coaxed past her lips, whispered reassurances into the heavy silence. When her eyes finally stayed open long enough to meet his, she whispered a single name. "Miriam, Miriam Zuck." Her voice was raw, cracked from rope and despair. Kenneth gave a short nod. "Rest, Miriam. You're safe here." Tears welled in her eyes, hot and bitter. "Safe? There's no such thing. Not for me." Bit by bit, the truth spilled out, torn from her like confession. Miriam was the daughter of Jacob Zuck, a hard-faced Amish farmer whose debts had grown too large to ignore. To settle them, he had bargained her away like cattle to a neighbor twice her age, a widower named Elias Pike. Pike had offered land in exchange for her hand, and Jacob, unmoved by her pleas, had agreed. "I begged him," Miriam choked, clutching the quilt tighter. "I told him I could work harder, find another way, but he looked at me the way he always has, like a burden, like too much of me was never enough, and then he signed the papers." She turned her face into the shadows, ashamed. "I ran. I thought if I ended it, at least the shame would end with me." Kenneth listened, his broad shoulders taut with fury he didn't show. He had seen soldiers traded away by commanders who thought them expendable. He had buried his own wife after fever stole her, powerless to change it. But watching this young woman confess how her own father had cast her aside lit a fire deep in his chest. When her hands trembled, she fumbled with a folded scrap she had carried in her pocket. She pressed it into Kenneth's calloused palm. he unfolded the parchment, frowning at the ink. It was more than a promise, it was a contract, signed and witnessed by the township clerk. The words leapt out at him. Whosoever takes possession of the cabin at Miller's Pass shall, by binding covenant, also take Miriam Zook as lawful wife. Kenneth stared, disbelief hardening into grim recognition. This was hidden from you? She nodded, shame and anger twisting her features. He thought no one would want the cabin. He thought it was safe. But now you bought it. You paid the 10 cents. And by their law, I belong to you. The cabin fell silent. The fire crackled in the hearth. The wind rattled through the chinks in the walls. But between them hung a truth neither had expected. Miriam's face crumpled. I never asked for this. I never asked to be bound like some farm animal. Kenneth folded the paper and set it on the table with slow precision. His voice was quiet but firm. Nor did I ask to own a woman. But I'll tell you this, I'll not treat you as property. You may stay if you wish. You may leave if you wish. But what you will never be, Miriam Zook, is unwanted again. Her eyes widened, searching his face for mockery. She found none. Only a man scarred by his own losses, vowing, without flourish, without hesitation, that her life had value. For the first time since she had tightened that rope around her neck, Miriam felt a sliver of something stir inside her. Not safety yet, not trust, but the faintest ember of hope. The first dawn after Miriam's rescue broke cold and brittle, frost silvering the meadow outside the cabin. Kenneth rose early, as he always did, stoking the hearth and setting coffee to boil in a battered tin pot. He glanced toward the narrow bed in the corner where Miriam lay curled beneath the quilt, her breath steady now, her face less haunted. When she stirred, he offered her a bowl of porridge. She hesitated, unused to kindness delivered without condition. I can't repay you, she whispered. Kenneth shrugged. Eat anyway. It was the beginning of a rhythm neither had expected. Kenneth's world was hard, carved from wood and stone, and he drew Miriam into it gently but firmly. On the second morning, he placed an axe in her hands, guiding her stance as they faced a log together. It'll buck if you're timid, he said, his hand steadying her grip. Swing with purpose. She raised the axe, clumsy, her arms trembling. The first blow barely dented the wood. Frustration burned in her cheeks, memories of her father's scorn whispering she was useless. But Kenneth only adjusted her shoulders, patient as stone. Again. By the third strike, the log cracked. The sound startled a laugh from her, quick, unguarded, almost childlike. Kenneth allowed himself the faintest smile. The days became lessons, stitched together by silence and small triumphs. Miriam learned to set rabbit snares with twine, her fingers fumbling until they found the rhythm. She learned to guide the cabin's old mare down the trail, clutching the reins with fear, until Kenneth's steady voice from beside her gave courage. At night, they sat near the fire, he carving wood with his knife, she sketching in the notebook he had pressed back into her hands, the one she thought ruined forever. One evening, she showed him a drawing, the outline of the cabin itself, smoke curling from the chimney, a figure at the door. His brows lifted at the likeness. "You've got an eye," he said. "I've only ever been told I have a heavy hand," she murmured. His gaze met hers, unwavering. "That's because they feared what you could make of it." The journey wasn't without shadows. More than once, when Kenneth returned from town with supplies, he brought back the townsfolk's whispers. They called Miriam the fat Amish bride, mocked Kenneth for paying 10 cents for what no one else wanted. The cruelty rolled off his back, but Miriam felt each word like a stone. One afternoon, while gathering water from the stream, she confessed in a broken voice, "They're right. I am too much, too large, too plain. Even God didn't want me." Kenneth's jaw tightened. He crouched so his eyes met hers squarely. "I've buried those I loved. I know what unwanted looks like. You are not it. You are flesh and spirit alive, with fire enough to split wood and draw life onto paper. That is no mistake." Her eyes brimmed. The words didn't erase the years of shame, but they struck deep enough to plant something stronger. The belief that perhaps she was not the burden she had been told she was. Winter crept closer, sharpening the mountain winds. Together they gathered wood, patched leaks in the roof, salted meat. Miriam's hands grew calloused, her arms stronger. The clumsy girl who had stumbled through chores became a woman who carried her share of the work. And still, each night, Kenneth set her bowl first at the table, offered her the better blanket, listened when she spoke. No grand declarations, no fine poetry, only the quiet, unshakable acts of a man who treated her not as a contract or a burden, but as a partner. For Miriam, it was bewildering. For Kenneth, it was instinct. And somewhere between firelight and frost, the cabin on Miller's Pass became less a refuge for ghosts and more the beginning of something new. By December, the mountains lay wrapped in white. Snow piled thick against the cabin walls, muffling the world into silence. Inside, however, life beat steady and warm. What had once been a cold, forgotten shack was slowly becoming a home, and much of it was Miriam's doing. She began with the small things. Curtains sewn from flour sacks now hung across the narrow windows, softening the bite of winter light. A patchwork quilt she stitched by the fire covered the bed Kenneth had built years before but never used with comfort. On the shelves, she placed jars of dried herbs and polished tin cups, so that the cabin no longer looked like a place of exile, but of care. Kenneth watched these transformations in silence, but the way his shoulders eased each evening betrayed what he felt. For so long, his cabin had been only walls to keep out the cold, a fortress for a solitary man. Now it breathed again. Their days followed a rhythm that grew as familiar as the creak of the rocking chair. Kenneth chopped wood in the early hours, his axe striking through frost and silence, while Miriam kneaded dough on the broad table, her hands dusted with flour. At noon, they ate together, always with Kenneth setting her bowl first before his own. In the evenings, they shared quiet labor, he carving shapes from wood, she mending clothes or sketching by firelight. Sometimes she caught him watching her, not with pity, not with judgment, but with a steadiness that left her throat tight. Once, when she dropped her needle and muttered about clumsy hands, he picked it up and said, "Those hands split logs clean. They're strong hands. Don't speak against them." Tenderness crept into their lives through gestures so small they might have gone unnoticed. When snow leaked through the roof during a storm, Kenneth lifted her onto his shoulders to patch the shingles, steadying her as though she were made of glass. When her boots wore thin, he worked leather late into the night, leaving a new pair by her bedside come morning. In return, Miriam wove warmth into his world. She seasoned his stews with herbs he had never thought to gather, lined his coat with wool she spun from scraps, and filled the silence with humming, the same hymns her mother had sung before dawn back on the farm. One evening, as she sang low while stirring the pot, Kenneth looked up from his carving. His eyes, usually shadowed, softened in the firelight. "It sounds like home," he murmured. Her voice faltered, a lump rising in her throat. "I never thought I'd hear that word spoken about me." "You've given it back to this place," he said simply. Yet shadows lingered. When Kenneth ventured into town for supplies, whispers followed him. The men at the saloon mocked under their breath about the fat Amish bride, claiming Kenneth had been tricked into buying both cabin and woman for 10 cents. He ignored them, but Miriam saw the strain in the set of his jaw when he returned. One night, when he came home later than usual, she asked gently, "They speak of me, don't they?" He paused, then nodded once. "They don't see you as I do." Her heart clenched. "And how do you see me?" He looked at her then, the silence stretching between them. At last he said, "As the woman who turned my exile into a home, as someone worth every fight I've left in me." Her breath caught, tears pricking her eyes. She had been told all her life she was too much, too heavy, too plain, too unwanted. But here, in a cabin once lifeless, she had become enough, more than enough. Winter deepened, and with it their closeness. On storm nights, when wind howled through the pass, Miriam would sit near the fire with her sketchbook, capturing the curve of Kenneth's shoulders bent over his work. Sometimes he noticed, sometimes he didn't. But one night, when she left the drawing on the table, she returned to find he had slipped it into a wooden frame he'd carved. "It's not much," he said, embarrassed, "but it deserves a place on the wall." She touched the frame, her chest aching with a mixture of wonder and gratitude. No one had ever honored her work before. By the time the snows began to thaw, Kenneth and Miriam had woven their days together like threads in a single cloth. He, the mountain man scarred by loss, and she, the girl discarded by her own kin, had found in each other something neither had dared to hope for. But peace in the mountains was fragile. The rumors from town grew louder. The railroad men with their maps and hunger drew nearer, and buried in Kenneth's eyes was a fear Miriam could not yet name, the fear that what they had built might not withstand the world pressing in. Spring brought thawing snow, and with it, trouble. Riders appeared on the trail to Miller's Pass, men in fine coats and bowler hats, their boots too clean for mountain mud. They carried ledgers and maps, their voices smooth as silk but cold beneath the polish. One introduced himself as Thomas Wheeler, representative of Western Pacific Railroad. "You sit on land that isn't rightly yours," Wheeler declared, standing in the cabin's doorway as if the place were already his. "Our company purchased title from Jacob Zuck himself. By law, this cabin and the acres surrounding it belong to us." Miriam stiffened. "My father had no right. That land was passed to me in covenant. Wheeler cut her off with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your father signed. That's enough. You and your mountain man here have 24 hours to clear out." He left the notice pinned to the door, his boots clicking as though the matter were finished. Miriam's hand shook as she ripped the paper down. "He sold it again," she whispered, voice cracking. "He gave me away once to Pike, and now he's sold the ground beneath my feet." Kenneth's jaw hardened, but his voice was steady. "Then we fight. Paper isn't truth, not when it's built on lies. They rode down into Silver Bluff, Miriam's fear braided with resolve. At the county office, she combed through dusty ledgers until her fingers blackened with ink. At last, she found it, her father's original covenant, signed years before, transferring 50 acres, including the spring-fed meadow, to her name. The document bore the seal of Pennsylvania, registered before their move west. "It's valid?" she whispered, clutching the fragile parchment. "It's mine." Kenneth nodded once. "Then we'll show them." But truth on paper did not silence wagging tongues. At the next town gathering, Wheeler and his superior, Augustus Pierce, stood tall before the townsfolk, sneering as Miriam presented her covenant. Laughter rippled through the crowd. "Look at her," Pierce mocked, "a woman too heavy for farm work, too plain to wed, waving papers she doesn't understand. You expect us to believe she can defend land against the future of the railroad?" Heat flamed across Miriam's face. The old shame pressed heavy, urging her to shrink. But then she felt Kenneth's hand brush hers, firm, grounding. She raised her voice louder than she thought she could. "This land is not just soil and stone. It is covenant. It is memory, and no company built on greed will take it." The room fell quiet, some shifting uneasily. Among them, Pastor John Avery spoke up, his voice carrying, "The girl is right. A covenant stands before God and law, and she has proof." The balance shifted, murmurs replacing jeers. Wheeler's smile faltered, yet power rarely yields easily. Days later, as Kenneth hauled timber, riders returned under cover of dusk. Pike among them, Elias Pike, the very neighbor her father once tried to force upon her. His smirk was venomous. "Still playing wife to a mountain ghost?" he taunted Miriam. "You were promised to me, girl, and one way or another, I'll collect what's mine." Kenneth moved before the words had settled, his frame filling the doorway. His voice was low, dangerous. "She belongs to no man, not you, not me. She chooses." The men laughed, but there was no mistaking the promise in Kenneth's eyes. Blood would be shed if they stepped closer. They withdrew, for now. But Miriam saw the bruises on Kenneth's knuckles that night, the shadows in his eyes as he washed blood from his hands. She touched his arm gently. "You've fought enough for me. I can fight too." His gaze softened, pain flickering. "I've lost too much already. I can't lose you too." The words slipped out before he could take them back. For the first time, Miriam glimpsed the depth of his scars, the family lost to smallpox, the war that had left him hollow. His solitude had been his shield, and now she was the crack in it. She laid her hand over his. "Then we fight together, not as burden and savior, as two who've been cast aside, but will not be broken." Kenneth searched her face, and in that moment, something shifted. She was no longer the desperate girl he had cut down from a rope, but a woman standing beside him. And he knew the railroad's greed, Pike's threats, even the town's scorn. They would face them, side by side. The attack came on a night when the wind howled through Miller's Pass like a living beast. Miriam had just banked the fire when hooves thundered in the clearing. Lanterns flared outside, shadows of men stretching long across the cabin walls. Kenneth was already on his feet, hammer in hand. His eyes met hers, steady, fierce. "Stay behind me." Before she could answer, the door shuddered under the first blow. A voice she knew too well rang out. Pike, dripping with triumph. "Come out, Boone. Hand over the girl and the deed, or we'll take them from your cold hands." The next crash splintered the latch. The door burst wide, and Pike stormed in with Wheeler's hired men at his back. Guns glinted in the lamplight, their faces twisted with greed. Kenneth met them like a wall of iron. His hammer swung, breaking a rifle clean from its stock, sending men scrambling. But they were many, and for everyone he felled, another pressed forward. Miriam's chest heaved. Fear clawed at her, whispering she was nothing, she was weak. Yet louder came the memory of Kenneth's words. She chooses. She did not choose fear. Her eyes fell on the iron poker by the hearth. She seized it, the weight staggering at first, then solid in her grip. When one man lunged past Kenneth toward her, she swung with every ounce of strength. The crack of iron against his arm sent him reeling. "I will not be taken!" she cried, her voice ringing clearer than the storm outside. The men faltered, startled by the fury in her. Kenneth fought harder, fueled by the sight of her standing tall beside him. Pike, enraged, pushed through the chaos, lunging straight for Miriam. Kenneth caught him mid-stride, slamming him against the wall. The hammer's head pressed to Pike's chest, Kenneth's voice low and deadly. "This land, this woman, neither belongs to you." The firelight burned in his eyes. For a moment, even Pike, swaggering, cruel Pike, saw the soldier who had once commanded battlefields. He stumbled back, fury curdling into fear. One by one, Wheeler's men lowered their weapons, dragging their wounded out into the storm. Pike spat in the snow, but followed, his threats fading with the hoofbeats. Silence fell. The only sound was Miriam's ragged breathing, the poker still trembling in her hands. Kenneth turned, crossing the room in 2 strides. He cupped her face in his rough, bloodied palm, his voice breaking. "You stood. God help me, Miriam, you stood." Her tears spilled, hot and fierce. "I won't be nothing any more, not to them, not to myself." He drew her against him, the hammer falling to the floor with a dull thud. For the first time since loss had hollowed him, Kenneth Boone held not a ghost, but a living, breathing woman who had chosen to fight beside him. And in the storm-lashed night, the cabin stood unbroken, because within it, so did they. Dawn broke pale over Miller's Pass, the snow glittering like shards of glass across the clearing. The cabin stood scarred but standing, smoke curling gently from its chimney. Inside, the fire burned low, casting a warm glow against rough-hewn walls. Miriam sat wrapped in a wool blanket, the iron poker resting by the hearth like a sentinel. Kenneth moved quietly about the room, tending to bruises with steady hands, his silence deeper than words. At last he lowered himself onto the bench beside her. The weight of his frame bent the wood, but his touch on her hand was feather-light. "You're safe here," he said, voice husky with exhaustion. Then softer, as though afraid of breaking the spell. "It's your home now, if you'll have it." Miriam's throat tightened. All her life she had been a burden, a pawn, a girl sold and scorned, and yet here, on land that was truly hers in the arms of a man who had seen her worth, she was something more. Tears welled, not of sorrow this time, but release. "Yes," she whispered, fingers curling into his. "Yes, I'll have it. I'll have you." He pulled her close, and for a long moment the only sound was the crackle of fire and the hush of snow outside. Yet even as warmth cocooned them, questions lingered. The railroad would not give up so easily. The town's whispers might never fade. The world beyond the mountains still judged harshly. But within these walls, with faith and resolve binding them together, there was a beginning, and perhaps, just perhaps, that would be enough to face whatever storms tomorrow brought. Every time I share a story like Kenneth and Miriam's, I'm reminded that love can rise from the harshest winters and shine even against the darkest doubts. Their journey asks us to believe that strength is not in appearance, but in standing for each other when the world turns cruel. Where are you listening from tonight? I'd love to know your corner of the world, and if you still believe in love that heals, that protects, that chooses us even when others don't, stay with me. The next story I tell will be for you.